Between 1939 and 1945, World War II devastated continents and claimed millions of lives. While history often focuses on battlefield casualties and military campaigns, there exists a chapter written in the shadows, the experiences of women prisoners of war, whose suffering was compounded by gender-based violence that violated every principle of humanity. This is their story, a story of survival, resilience, and the ongoing fight for justice and remembrance. When we think about prisoners of war, we often picture soldiers in camps. But during World War II, nurses, resistance fighters, civilians caught in occupied territories, and women serving in various military capacities found themselves imprisoned. The Geneva Conventions were supposed to protect them. In reality, those protections were systematically violated by multiple forces across different theaters of war. As armies swept across Europe and Asia, tens of thousands of women fell into enemy hands. Among them were military nurses captured in the Pacific Theater, resistance fighters in occupied Europe, civilian women in territories under occupation, and women serving in auxiliary military roles. The 1929 Geneva Convention explicitly protected prisoners of war from violence, intimidation, and what it called public curiosity. What happened to women prisoners constituted clear war crimes, systematic, documented, and deliberate violations of international law. In December 1941, as Japanese forces swept through the Philippines, 77 American and Filipino nurses were captured and held for 37 months. These women would later be known as the Angels of Bataan. They faced brutal conditions, starvation, disease, and constant psychological torment. While their captors generally refrained from the worst forms of sexual violence against American nurses due to strategic concerns about international condemnation, this was not the case for Filipino nurses and civilians who suffered horrifically. Throughout the Pacific, in places like Manila, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, documented testimonies reveal systematic sexual violence against women prisoners. One particularly documented case involves what became known as the Comfort Women System. Between 1932 and 1945, an estimated 200,000 women, primarily from Korea, China, the Philippines, and other occupied territories, were forced into sexual slavery in what Japan euphemistically called comfort stations. These were not prisoners of war in the traditional sense, but women imprisoned and enslaved specifically for systematic rape. Documents discovered in Japanese archives prove this was an organized military system, not isolated incidents. Women were deceived, kidnapped, or coerced. They endured repeated assaults, often multiple times daily. Many did not survive. Those who did carried physical and psychological scars for life. One survivor, Kim Hak-sun, who was 17 when taken, later testified that she was promised work in a factory. Instead, she was taken to a place where soldiers came every day. She wanted to die, she said. Many of them did die. It would take decades before survivors like Kim found the courage to speak publicly, breaking half a century of silence. In Europe, women resistance fighters, political prisoners, and those deemed enemies of the Nazi state faced imprisonment in concentration camps where sexual violence was both a tool of terror and a demonstration of absolute power. At Ravensbrück, the only major Nazi concentration camp designed primarily for women, over 130,000 women were imprisoned. Sexual violence there took many forms, from forced prostitution to assaults by guards, to horrific medical experiments that violated their bodies in the name of pseudoscience. Survivor testimonies document that women prisoners faced unique vulnerabilities. Guards exploited their power systematically. At the Nuremberg trials, prosecutors documented numerous instances of sexual violence, though the focus often remained on other categories of war crimes. Testimony revealed patterns of abuse across multiple camps. Yet women survivors often felt they couldn't speak about sexual violence. The shame, which should have belonged entirely to the perpetrators, was placed on victims by society. Many took these secrets to their graves. Only in recent decades have historians begun to fully document this dimension of the Holocaust. In Eastern Europe, as the Red Army advanced westward, they too perpetrated mass sexual violence against German women and women in occupied territories. Estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of women were assaulted during the Soviet advance into Germany. What happened in 1945 as the war ended represented another massive wave of gender-based violence. Women's bodies became battlegrounds for revenge, conquest, and demonstrations of power. This continued even after the shooting stopped. When the war ended, the world began to reckon with unprecedented atrocities. But justice for gender-based crimes proved elusive. At Nuremberg and Tokyo, prosecutions occurred, but sexual violence was rarely treated as a distinct war crime. It was subsumed under inhumane treatment, or crimes against humanity, without specific recognition. This would have lasting implications for how international law treated sexual violence and conflict for decades to come. Some perpetrators faced justice, many did not, and many survivors never received acknowledgement, compensation, or even an apology. For decades, survivors fought for recognition. Korean comfort women held weekly demonstrations outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul, rain or shine, for years. Ravensbrück survivors testified at trials whenever they could. Filipino women shared their stories with historians who would listen. One survivor's daughter recalled that her mother never spoke about what happened until she was 80 years old. Then one day, she said she needed to tell the truth before she died. She said it wasn't her shame to carry, it was history's shame. This sentiment echoed across generations of survivors who finally found their voices. The experiences of women prisoners in World War II fundamentally changed how the international community approaches wartime sexual violence. In the 1990s, tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda explicitly prosecuted rape as a war crime and crime against humanity for the first time. In 2008, the UN Security Council recognized sexual violence in conflict as a threat to international peace and security. These women's testimonies, given decades after the war, became the foundation for modern international humanitarian law regarding sexual violence and conflict. Their courage to speak transformed justice itself. Today, memorials stand in Seoul, Manila, Berlin, and Ravensbrück. Museums document these stories. Survivors' testimonies are preserved in archives around the world. We remember not just to honor the past, but to prevent the future. Sexual violence and conflict didn't end in 1945. It continues in conflict zones today, from Bosnia to Rwanda to Syria to Ukraine. These survivors showed us that silence enables impunity. Speaking truth enables justice. The women who survived World War II as prisoners carried burdens no one should bear. Many are gone now. Their numbers dwindle each year as time takes what war could not. But their testimonies remain, demanding we remember, demanding we learn, demanding we do better. Their voices, once silenced by shame and trauma, now speak across generations. They remind us that in documenting the worst of humanity, we honor the resilience of those who survived it. They teach us that bearing witness, however painful, is an act of resistance against forgetting. In their memory and in service to future generations, we must ensure that these stories are never lost, that this history is never sanitized, and that the dignity of survivors is never again sacrificed to the comfort of those who would prefer to look away.